found so interesting for people, check out this book. It's really, really cool because while there is a certain amount of geeky science-dom to it that really explains the experiments, Brian does an amazing job at translating what that looks like in practicality. So like you can see, what, a bunch of monkeys will do, but then you could sort of see how it works amongst people. I was very, of course, intrigued by the tyrants and psychopaths chapter, but I was wondering if you could, because this is something that I've heard of, is the Dark Triad of traits, and I think that this is something that we all mention in passing. We watch so many shows like Criminal Minds or whatever, and we say, "Oh, he's a psychopath." Oh, that's very Machiavellian. I mean, but we throw around these terms. But if you would explain the Dark Triad and what that looks like and how that is pervasive in people that seek leadership roles.
Sure. So, my background, I'm a political scientist, and my background is I used to study exclusively dictators and despots. And then I started to wonder, whether some of the personality traits that I was seeing when I was interviewing people who used to be in charge in authoritarian countries also had commonalities with the sort of tyrannical personality traits of the psychopaths in mid-level management or in homeowners associations or closer to home. And so one of the chapters deals with what, as you said, is called the Dark Triad, which is basically three, as the name suggests, traits. One is Machiavellianism, the idea that the ends justifies the means. And it's sort of in a human form. It's this idea of sort of very cold, calculating, strategic action in which you're willing to throw anybody under the bus in order to get to the top. Then you have narcissism, which a lot of us know what that means. It's sort of the egotistical drive to make other people like you, and can be quite defective in extreme quantities, as we see with the last president of the United States. And then psychopathy, which is whether you're a psychopath or not, which is usually somebody who has superficial charm, but has effectively a broken brain. Their amygdala and other parts of their brain don't work the same way as the rest of us. So while we have empathy switched on by default, and we can try to turn it off with a few mental tricks, psychopaths have it turned off by default, and they can try to turn it on, but automatically they're not really empathic people. And people with the Dark Triad are disproportionately drawn to power and disproportionately good at obtaining it.
Right. One of the stories that I thought was very interesting, I can't remember the guy's name, the superintendent, who was
the janitor, Steve Rouchy.
The janitor, right. And was basically like a mafia boss, a mob boss, controlling his little fiefdom. And yet he wasn't very good at it because he wasn't really good at masking his psychopathic tendencies. And what's so scary about that is basically what I've gotten is the really successful psychopaths are the ones you don't know are psychopaths. So how can you address that? Like clearly in the story, like that one, they saw that this guy was unhinged. Most people saw that he was unhinged. And after time, that can only go on for so long. But the successful psychopaths, which to me, I would love to give this test to everybody sitting in Congress. I think that the numbers would be astronomical.
Yeah, so, I mean, I talked to a lot of psychopath experts in researching the book, and the line that came up again and again is that the unsuccessful psychopaths are in prison. The successful psychopaths are in business and politics. And what they basically meant by that is that there's a certain level of psychopathy that can be sometimes advantageous, at least at getting power, not necessarily at wielding power. The studies that I go into in the book show that there's an effectiveness to being this psychopathic individual at sort of climbing the ranks. But once you get there, you actually wield power less effectively. Now, the unsuccessful psychopaths can't control their impulses. So they end up acting out in ways that are very damaging to their own careers. And they often end up committing crimes for which they get caught, and they end up in jail. But I think, there's a broader point here that's not just about psychopaths or people with Dark Triad traits. It's a broader discussion about power hungry people. And I think when you ask, how do we solve this problem? Because there are successful psychopaths masquerading as normal people, and there's also power hungry, corruptible people who are in positions of authority. What you have to do is you have to acknowledge a basic fact that I think I establish in the book, which is that bad people are disproportionately drawn to power, disproportionately good at getting it, and disproportionately good at staying in power. So what you have to do is reverse engineer the system with that fact in mind and think, okay, let's assume that every time we have a position of authority, from a homeowners association to a police department to the president of the United States, the people drawn to that like a magnet are going to be worse people on average than the sort of rest of society. And so you have to figure out a way to weed them out to attract better people. And that's a lot of what I talk about in the last sort of third of the book with some of the suggestions for how to fix this.
Yeah, I found one of those very interesting was, and I know I'm going to mess this up, sortition.
That's right.
Okay? That's the right sortition. And I think that, like, to me, that's brilliant. I love that idea. I think that's really great. But if you would explain, it's basically for people like having national jury duty to help, oversee issues, and you get people that are just stuck doing it even though they don't want to. But explain sortition and how that could be used to maybe help us weed out bad apples.
Yeah. So, I mean, given that we know that power-hungry people are drawn to power for the wrong reasons, sortition is this idea that comes from the ancient world. And basically, there was a device in ancient Greece called the clariterion, where they would basically have a randomization to figure out who would serve in a citizen assembly. And that assembly would actually wield power. Now, some political scientists have actually suggested using sortition for politics. They would say, instead of having Congress elected, just randomly allocate 435 people and sort out the problems that way. I don't actually think that's the right solution, because I think there are some things about politics that, having a career in it and some expertise is actually quite helpful. What I do think is worth pursuing is oversight by sortition. So in other words, you'd have a parallel Congress in the United States context where you'd have 435 randomly allocated people in a citizen assembly house. And every time the House debated something, so would the citizen assembly. And they would independently come up with a vote or a solution or a proposal for how to solve a problem, from climate change to police reform, whatever it is. And the point is that it wouldn't be binding. So the House could still do whatever they wanted. But the point would be that the citizens of the rest of the country would see what randomly allocated people would do without lobbyists, without pressures from getting reelected and so on. And then the politicians would have to reconcile the difference. They'd have to explain, why is it that you came up with a very different solution that seems to be very good for the lobbyists and seems to be very good for your bottom line, for your stocks, whatever it is, from what the citizen assembly said. And that, I think, would create pressure to counteract some of the bad parts of people in power. I think you could do this in business, by the way, too. Like, boards, which often are quite myopic for profits, if they had a citizen assembly of randomly allocated employees, I think the companies would be forced to respond to employee grievances much more. So it's one of the many ways. And I think, one of the things that I was struck by when I was coming up with these ideas to fix the systems of power we have is they're not necessarily rocket science, right? These are not like some sort of, ivory tower proposal that's impossible to imagine. It's just that we don't really try. I mean, we haven't really made an effort to try to counteract this aspect of power, despite the fact that most of us are very unhappy with the people who are in leadership positions right now across the country.
Yeah.
And you we're speaking with Brian Klaas, author of Corruptible. One thing that I've found very interesting, and this is the big thing about our podcast, is we talk about what is the corrupting issue of our time, and that is corporate special interest money in our political sphere. And you talk about the fact that as much as the individual plays a role, the system allows the bad individual to basically take over. It's kind of, as you had mentioned, sort of reflecting the way things work, let's say in a country like India versus Denmark. It is very true that if the system is corrupt, it's going to attract a certain type of person that is going to end up in positions of power. We have good people in positions of power in the United States, but they are a microcosm of the actual system at large. And so when people get very frustrated about the fact that not much gets done on Capitol Hill, let's say, it has a lot to do with the fact that the overwhelming majority of people that are there are completely bought by the system. How much do you think corporate special interest money in our political system plays a role in the way that we elect the type of representatives in this country that speak, obviously are who you speak about in the book?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in general, I try to talk about, as you rightly point out, the system having a massive effect. It's the interplay between the individual and the system they inhabit. So a good person can go into a bad system and turn bad. A bad system can go into a good system and behave better. And so I explore this with a few different ways. You referenced one of the studies with Denmark and India. There's also, I took a ski lesson with Paul Bremer, who used to rule Iraq as the viceroy and behaved differently in two different systems. Anyway, the point with the corporate special interests is that I think that a lot of good, decent people want to serve their communities in the United States. And I think when they actually start thinking about what that means, what it means to raise money for a campaign, what it means to actually go into the spotlight where you're going to have every possible detail from your past scrutinized and exposed by people who want to destroy you, they start to think, do I want to do that? Do I want to have to call lobbyists all the time and take their phone calls and then, try to get fundraising from corporate interests that I don't actually agree with? And so what happens is the people who aren't bothered by all those things, they say, I'll go for it, right? I'm going to be a candidate. I'm going to run. And most of the people, it's not all the people, but most of the people who think, I don't want to do that, they're repulsed by it and they avoid it. And of course, we get good candidates who deal with this, right? They just sort of say, I care so much that I will put up with this. And that's wonderful when we have those people. But do we really want to design a system where most people are repulsed by it? And I think the really big thing that I'm worried about right now watching, I finished writing this book, several months ago. So it's a little bit, I didn't add this part to it. But the thing that's happened in recent months is the school board meetings and the local city councils where people are getting death threats for imposing mask mandates in line with, public health guidance and so on. What is the local level leadership going to look like if now the cost of even your local school board is death threats, harassment, exposure, all these awful things? So, I think we have to reflect on what kind of system we want people to be drawn to. And the current one we have is, as you say, dominated by a lot of very ugly stuff that repulses the right kinds of leaders.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.